So how many of you would consider yourself populists? Just want to get this out of the way. Yeah, great. So I just want to, okay, good. I just want to make sure we have, and I want to thank you for being here. We look forward to engaging. We have a great panel to discuss, will the rise of populism, meaning you folks, destroy liberal democracy? And do this. And we have with us a fantastic panel. Michael McFaul, my friend, served in the Obama administration as U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. You'll see him all the time, often with me on MSNBC. So great to have Ambassador McFaul. We have Ambassador Peter Wittig, who's the German ambassador to the United States. If you haven't noticed, there's a lot of stuff going on in Germany. Donald Trump is heading over there shortly for the G20 meeting in Hamburg, and I'm sure there will be fireworks. And who knows what the handshake will be like. Then we have Jane Harman.
That was a good one.
Jane Harman, a longtime serving member of Congress who's now president of the Woodrow Wilson Center for National Scholars in Washington, has done an out job, and really one of the leading thinkers, and I won't even say women thinkers, but thinkers on international security, intelligence, and all of that entails, and has served our country greatly and has a great home up the hill. So, Jane, thank you. And we have Edward Luce.
Which you didn't show up at the other night.
Yeah, there was a national security reason for that. And then we have Edward Luce, who is chief U.S. commentator for the Financial Times, and he has a new book out. You can get it. You can even get it by e-form, but I insisted that Amazon send me mine. I've just gone through and marked up this copy. Called The Retreat of Western Liberalism. And he says it's a 3-hour read. It's actually a 2-hour and 20-minute read. And it's a fascinating. But let me just open up a conversation. Let's open the conversation. We're going to come to all of you as well. And let me just, I guess, start with Mike for a minute. Mike, you have been part of an administration that tried very hard to kind of create dimensions of a new social contract inside the United States. And that is not holding. And there was a lot of frustration in reaction to that social contract and people feeling as if their lives are curtailed. And not only has that been happening here, but we've seen through reactions to crises and stresses in Europe. And then that adds this other dimension of what in the heck is going on with Russia and Vladimir Putin. So can you give me just a 30-second
Let's leave Putin for the next round.
Yeah, just help frame this populism question.
So great to be back at Aspen. Great that you asked me the first question, because I want to take off my ambassadorial hat and put on my professorial hat. I teach at Stanford, and we have a big project on populism right now at Stanford, like a lot of other places do. And let me just say a couple of framing things about how I want to approach this from a social science point of view, and then we'll get to the policy stuff in a minute. First, let's try to understand the magnitude and historical context of our moment, right? On the magnitude, let's remember that, yes, there is rise of populism, and I have the data in my pocket if you want to get the precise numbers in Europe and most certainly in the United States. But there's a lot of variation on that. It's not uniform over time. Some places aren't experiencing it at all. Canada seems to do pretty well. France had a scare. Maybe we'll hear about Germany in a minute. And so populism should be populisms. There's not one global populist movement. There's lots of different populist movements and lots of variation on terms of what we're trying to explain. Second historical thing, it's always compared to what? The end of liberal order?
Right.
Is this really scary?
That's Ed's book. He's next.
Well, okay, compared to the 1930s, not so much. Compared to the 1970s, not so much. Let's remember that there was a time, I see enough gray hair in this room that you will remember, there was this thing called communism. It was rising, and in the 70s, Indochina fell, Southern Africa fell. There was a real threat to the liberal order then. That was not too long ago. So that's the framing issue first. The second big thing I would say, and maybe we're going to get to this in a minute, is we really need to have a much better understanding of the causes of populism, and again, not to treat it as a one universal thing. I think it's a pretty sloppy debate so far. And Ed, I have not read your book, except for that book. But is this because of the China shock? Is this because of automation? Is this because of immigration? Is it because of ideologues that have risen up, including in our own country? And what is the role of institutions in mediating populist movements versus outcomes? I think all of those things are at play. In some countries, they're in play more than others, and we just have to remember that there's not a unified story here. And I get really scared, just speaking of America, when there is this narrative about, and I've heard it at this conference, by the way, 2 or 3 times now, that the rise of the demise of the white working class in the middle of the country. I'm from Montana. I come from that I have lots of white working class relatives. They almost all voted for Trump. And that is real. But let's remember just how different our conversation would be had 77,000 of them voted a different way.
Right.
Let's remember how different our conversation would be if we had a different set of institutions, like, by the way, most of Europe does. And let's remember, before we predict that this is a long-term trajectory, I don't know. I want to be clear. I don't know what the moment is, and maybe in the next round I'll talk about the future. Right. But I do know that in 2008, my former boss got 48% of the vote in my home state in Montana.
Right.
That was just 8 years ago. That wasn't 50 years ago. And so I just would remind you that before we think we're off the ledge and this is the end of liberal democracy, remember how small the data sets here are, that had they gone, and same with Brexit, by the way, had it gone a different way, we might be having a different conversation.
So thank you for that. And there is this guy named Edward Luce, he happens to be on the panel, who answers you in this and says, and he does a thought experiment, had Hillary Clinton done this, had Brexit not happened, he argues, and you can defend in a moment, that the trends that we're seeing and the challenge to Western liberal democracy would be occurring anyway.
Yes.
That the shifts are so deep that the cosmetic notion that Hillary Clinton was there, and then he kind of slams Aspen in this. And I just want to read this to you.
I thought it was Davos, which is a
Yeah.
totally different
well,
thing to Aspen, of
you
course.
can pop in. One of the ironies of the West booming cities, and so the urban centers, is how much lip service its more fortunate denizens pay to a progressive worldview. We really couldn't ask for a nicer elite. Yet the effects of how they spend their money are hardly progressive. For all the emphasis we place on multicultural cities, they epitomize our oligarchic reality. In the US, the more liberal a city's politics, the higher the rate of inequality. These are some tough words, tough love for people who see themselves as doing good. And you read this book, and it is a depressing exercise. But Ed, I just want to get your sense, because you've thought deeply about the fissures and how deep they are. Mike has said, hey, we were pretty close to some alternative outcomes. You're saying that's BS, that doesn't matter, right?
No, I'm not saying that's BS, and I'm not saying that this is the end of liberal democracy for a moment. I'm saying that it's in retreat. Populism does take different forms in different countries. It's a sort of Tolstoyan unhappy family story. We each have different political cultures. But of course, booming liberal democracy takes different forms in different countries. What I'm trying to isolate here, which is something I think that's very, very real, that we have in common, and that we're dealing with in different ways, and that is namely the long-term structural effects of globalization, of what is otherwise a very positive story, of the rest, the 85% of the world that isn't the West, catching up with us, and the extraordinary age of abundance that new technology is bringing us. These two trends are the key trends, really. But they're having a very disruptive effect on the middle of our societies. And the middle of our economies is the stable center ground of our politics. So as Barrington Moore, the great American writer, said, no bourgeois, no democracy. If we do not attend to the needs of our bourgeois, to follow that language, then we are in trouble. And what gives me pause for optimism is what's happening in Peter's country. I think they have paid most attention to the well-being of their middle class. I think, unlike us in the English-speaking democracies, they do not confuse having a college degree with being skilled. Germany understands you can be skilled without a college degree and have a very good, dignified living. And I think that they have, not accidentally, got the strongest antibodies to populism in Germany right now. So I think, there is a variegated picture. I agree. What gives me pause for pessimism is the fact that in the largest English-speaking democracies, most importantly the United States, we have a president who's not only come to power on the back of this populism, but is going to deeply exacerbate the conditions that led to his election. The only sort of silver lining to Trump is that he's too incompetent to carry out this agenda.
That's what I call a tweetable moment. Ed is on Twitter.
Yes, I'm not live.
Yeah, but
I have to say, just to quickly pick up I have the deepest respect for Aspen, and please invite me back next year.
But Jane, thank you. And he really didn't mention Aspen. I just threw that in there for fun.
Yeah.
But Jane, you're the only one on the panel who actually had to go secure votes from people over and over and over again. And I think you have a deep, and you're also someone who's been highly critical of the party that you represented, the Democratic Party, for failing to connect on a lot of these issues. If you were president of the United States, what would you be doing to fix these problems?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be tweeting about MSNBC. And I just have to say, because this is the first public opportunity I've had, that not only do tweets like that diminish the excellent people who work for this president, but they also diminish his opportunity to form relationships with leaders around the world. And there are lots of capable leaders, some women, some men, who I'm sure are absolutely appalled by that, as I was. So there you go. Yeah, I don't know if anyone here other than I has sort of been in the crucible running for elected office, but I served for 9 terms in Congress. That was 17 elections because there were primaries. And in case you missed it, the primaries these days are harder than the general elections. And because I'm in the center of the Democratic Party, I was called by some of my party mates a traitor and a spy, and I should be in jail. You should know this, Edward, because of some of the positions I hold and believe in.
Right.
But so it was hard. But let me just make a comment a slightly different way than you asked the question, Steve, if it's okay with you. I've spent years thinking about the fact that security and liberty are not a zero-sum game. That's my field, intelligence and security. We need both. And I actually think that populism and a liberal order are not a zero-sum game either. We need both. And I think there is
That's
a place.
good news for our audience.
Well, I think welcome
right,
to the conversation. There is a place in the liberal order for people who are populist. And there, as Mike said, there's not just one flavor of populist. There's not just one flavor of liberal either, with a small L. And I think we have to find a way forward together. And I think the strains that have been exacerbated, not just by the rise of President Trump, but before President Trump, including in my own party, have really hurt America. And if we can't find a way to build bridges soon, we're going to hurt it further. And then the title of your book is going to be right. I just wanted to mention 5 things that I think are challenging the liberal order. I mentioned these the other day, but one of them, of course, is technology, which is displacing workers. And we have to find a way forward. The second is terrorism, which affects all of us. The third of them is the massive amount of refugees and displaced persons in the world, larger than ever, 65 million and counting. The fourth is climate change. However it occurs, it's happening. And the fifth, and this is the one that just pains me, and it is the reason I walked out of Congress in my 9th term to head this heavenly, nonpartisan space called the Wilson Center, toxic partisanship. It's killing us. It's just suffocating this country, and it is so tragic. And Aspen, to say something very positive about Aspen, not only can you breathe here, but we actually talk civilly to each other here.
And you just had a great session with Vice President Mike Pence in the Wilson Center, and have the Republicans now reversed zeroing the budget of the Wilson Center because Mike Pence spoke there?
It's only a third of our budget. Yeah, we're on the OMB zero list. We're a living memorial to a president, but hey. But Mike Pence is someone I served with in Congress for 10 years. And I went over to the White House one day, no problem going. I worked in a White House 1,000 years ago for Jimmy Carter, and talked to him about coming over to the Wilson Center. He immediately said, sure, what should we talk about?
Great.
And we decided to talk about Central America, which was the topic of a summit held in Miami recently with the presidents of the Central American countries and the foreign minister of Mexico. And he came over and we had a conversation about the issues.
I just want to say the thing that was striking about this, you should read Mike Pence's remarks and comments at the Wilson Center, because you will see details. You will see nuances. You will see complex sentences. So, anyway, Ambassador Wittig, Germany and Europe in general, because many people have looked at Donald Trump more as a manifestation of the times we're in, not as someone who's causing what's going on. And in Europe, you've seen refugee crisis, you've seen economic shocks, you've had terrorism shocks, and And I think in the way I would frame it, and I'm not sure that Mike McFaul would agree with me, but you have this tension between a kind of healthy nationalism in some of these countries and kind of dark nationalism. And dark nationalism seems to be rising in a lot of places. And Germany looked fragile for a while. Now it looks less fragile now. But are you part of the trends, or are you an outlier? How is the German scene? Take us down that boat.
Thank you, Steve. First of all, it's a pleasure, honor to be on that distinguished panel here. Populism is sort of nourished by grievances, social, economic grievances, and cultural identity grievances. And those grievances arose in Europe as well. But for some reason, and we were lucky in that regard, Germany is more resilient to populism than other countries. Why? First, we have an extremely good economic run. Record low unemployment, record low youth unemployment, which is very important, but pretty good social security system, less people that feel left behind, less losers of globalization, not a dramatic inequality. So there's a strong social tissue, and that has helped us. Secondly, Germany is probably one of the most pro-European countries in Europe, pro-Brussels. So nationalism is sort of checked, and there's no scapegoating, Brussels scapegoating, because we know we have benefited from Europe so much. The post-Cold War order for us, Germany, the most populous country in Europe, firmly embedded in the European Union, surrounded by friends only. That was, for us, the best of all worlds. So we don't have this anti-Brussels discourse. Thirdly, there is a sort of, a legacy of the past, right-wing thinking, right-wing discourse, authoritarian temptations are still stigmatized by the Nazi past. That's an important, they exist, there are undercurrents, but there's a lid on this. But having said all of this, we also have a populist right-wing party now, and this is the first time since the Second World War that they will probably make it to the parliament. So we are not totally immune to that. They have peaked, they're now at 8%, but they're not neo-Nazis, they're kind of, fueled by anti-immigration feeling, and that was sort of the pivotal moment in our country when the refugee crisis hit us. Those cultural identity grievances arose, and one of the reasons for populism.
Ed,
Can I just make a pro-German point to sort of add ballast to what you've just said? Austria, which has taken a very different path to its own history than Germany has, which has taken full ownership for the 20th century. Austria claimed to be a victim of Nazism and has presented its history to its people through its education curriculum that way. And I think it's no accident that whilst you are relatively impervious to right-wing populism in Germany, Austria came within a whisker of electing as its president a far-right candidate just a few months ago. And I think that's a real, there's a lesson here. It's not just about economics. It's about civic culture. And I think in the West, just one final point to pick up on what Peter said. In the West, there are big differences in how we deal with whether we're doing well or whether we're not doing well. What Peter just said about Germany, very modestly, we've been lucky. If this had been, the shoe had been on the other foot, and the United States and Britain were the ones doing well and least prone to populism, we would be beating our breasts and boasting at the top of our voices about how our model, we would be triumphalist. And I think there's a lesson there that the English-speaking democracies should take from what Peter just said.
Let me ask the audience, anybody happen to be from Bartlesville, Oklahoma? Really?
My
We're
goodness,
probably
I found
related.
somebody.
So my family helped settle Bartlesville, Oklahoma in the late 1800s, and I flew there the other day to pick up some boxes for my late mother. And Bartlesville is just north of Tulsa, just south of the Kansas border. And I stopped in to see my grandmother's neighbors who live in pretty constrained circumstances, met their grandkids and kids, and talked to them about their lives and how they were, and they're tough. And these are largely military families who've gone off and served, come back, and may have gotten a job at ConocoPhillips or more like some tech job. And the story over and over and over again is got a job, worked hard, got trained, and got laid off, and repeated times, and then said, oh, they were told, okay, go get yourself educated in something else. So many of them gone into healthcare. They pay about 50 grand for the healthcare training, and that turns into student loans that they become at very low salaries later committed to. It's just, if you want to go see real challenges in working America. So a lot of my family and relatives, I would say about 97% supported Donald Trump, and I don't see them as populists. I see them as people who looked at Washington as corrupt, not performing for them, and they even saw the Democratic Party and both parties as sort of snobbish. And so I just want to kind of break this down for a minute about what a populist is as we ascribe to Donald Trump and those people who voted and supported him. Are we making a mistake in how we think about that? Jane?
Absolutely.
Well, yes, we're making a mistake. And I don't think populists, and some of you can speak for yourselves, were necessarily for Donald Trump. I think they were against...
Or Bernie Sanders. They could have been Bernie Sanders.
Well, they were against the Washington establishment. Of course, the irony of Bernie Sanders is he's been in the swamp for years. I served with him in the House. Now he's in the Senate. And I haven't seen him make huge efforts in those institutions to enact the views he holds. I respect his views. But I'm just saying that a lot of people in both parties are to blame for the inadequate action to help displaced people in this country, many of whom are white, and some of them aren't. But just on the point of Germany, first of all, Germany has had good leadership, pretty solid leadership over many years, and still has very good, solid leadership, and a really good ambassador in Washington, whoever that is. But a point was made in a panel the other day that Germany spends 15 times what we spend on retraining workers. And our Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, I don't know how many of you know what that is the most feckless waste of money that Washington could field. And I am for trade. I think it helps people in your old town, Steve, but it has to be done with an eye toward helping those who are displaced by it upskill themselves and get other employment. And if we don't get on this program fast and do it right the way Germany has, we're going to have lots more populists, whatever that means, but lots more votes against everybody who serves in Washington.
Mike, you look like you want to comment.
Well, I mean, what is populism? I'm glad you problematize that because when I was looking to see who raise our hands, I'm kind of for democracy, and I can see how democracy and populism might go together, and I want accountability from my government. So it's a really tricky word, let's say that, number one. Number two, anti-elitism is what actually unites Hungarians and Americans, right? So they're not united on the economic thing. Like this is one of the things that are different, right? Hungary and Poland are two countries that have done, compared to where they were 25 years ago, much better GDP per capita, right, after the fall of communism. What unites them is it's anti-elitism, and what Donald Trump was for, of course, nobody knows what he's for. I mean, and my relatives in Montana, and in Michigan and Wisconsin, this is where the McFaul family,
of them, right?
yeah, here's where the McFaul family comes from. I keep waiting to see what's he's offering them. He's not offering them anything. To your point, well, there's going to be a backlash against that as well, right? And we'll be in that cycle. The third thing, though, I want to distinguish something else, just the difference between liberal democracy as a set of rules for governing and liberalism with a small l as an ideology. I think that's really important to distinguish because I'm not afraid of liberal democracy failing. Compared to the 30s, compared to this, I just don't see this as a comparable threat. I believe that at least in my country, I have a worry about it in some countries, but not here. We're not going to collapse.
Let me just challenge you both real quick, and we're going to go short form because
I
want
have
to
a
go to all of you.
bigger scare that I want to get to, so we don't forget it. But
Which one? Well, I'm going to pitch it to you because I want to. So in November 2016, The Atlantic had an article in there about the weaponization of social media. So part of what we're talking about is completely divorced right now from the notion of, is there somewhere a black box, maybe it's in Moscow, maybe it's in North Korea, maybe it's in Iran, of people who are trying to purposely aggravate these tensions, exacerbate these tensions, drive political outcomes that actually create an inauthentic drive in populism. So and this is the world of bots, of fake news, of hacking, of a kind of manipulation of the political order that's also part of the conversation today. And I think as we talk about authentic populism and authentic social strain, on top of it now we seem to have political espionage in place. And I'm just like to get just a quick snapshot from the four of you about how you see that, and do you see that as a resolvable issue? How am I gonna, so I know where you're going, and I wanted to ask you about that sense of threat, you know from where.
So two things I would say. I call it the illiberal international, right? So yes, there is a movement. Vladimir Putin is at the center of it. His job is to destroy liberal democracy in the West. I mean, I've sat this close to him and listened to him talk about it. That's what he wants to do. And by the way, he wasn't always of that framework. I've known him since 1991. He's evolved in his views. But right now, he sees that, and he's devoting real resources to achieve that outcome. Real resources, you know, money, bots, all, and by the way,
is that your big
soldiers.
fear?
No,
Oh.
no, it isn't. My big fear is something bigger. Don't get me wrong. In the short term, I think it's really serious, and we need to, most certainly in this country, take it more seriously. I'm cautiously optimistic that we finally are. By the way, I was in Tulsa 3 weeks ago talking about this very thing. Tulsa, red state, you know, they don't care about Russians. They love Trump. 2,500 people came to my talk to talk about exactly what you talked about. So remember, when you're generalizing about red states and blue states, there's a lot of purple people out there. Our elites are way more polarized than our society. There's a lot of great data that underscore that. My fear, and I want to put a question mark to this, but to Ed's point, in terms of those trends are real, right? I mean, 1944, 39% of American workers were in industrial jobs. Today, it's 8 or 9%, right? That's real, that's happening. What I don't know is where we're at in the cycle of this transformation. If you go back and you look at the agrarian to industrial cycle, there's two movements of populism that you need to remember. The first one is the one that it feels like we're in now, which is the farmers saying, you know, I want my jobs, I want to stay on my land, those stupid tractors, I love my horse, and all the, by the way, all the cultural things that went with that. That was the late 19th century, early 20th century. It was a real threat and a real thing. And that's what it feels like we're in today. Don't forget, there was another wave of populism. It was peasants who became workers. And they became workers, and they didn't like it. You know, that spawned some really scary things like communism and fascism. And if not for the reforms we did in the 30s, you know, that was a very scary time. And I feel like we're not even at that phase yet. You know, it's the UBIs of the world unite. Like, you know, that is to say, universal basic income. You know, in the Valley, that's what everybody loves. And I think that phase we're not even there yet. And so I'm quite nervous about those big structural things. I'm not nervous about democratic institutions.
Great. Peter?
Well, I mean, to come to your point, challenging our democratic process from outside. We are in an election campaign. Three months from now, we'll have general elections. Chancellor Merkel is vying for a fourth term. And we have an issue with Russia. We fear, and the German domestic intelligence had said there is increasing evidence of Russian interference in our political process. Now, attribution is always difficult, whether it's the government, whether it's Putin, whether it's just individual persons, but that has happened. They hacked in our system.
And why is everyone so spineless about that? Why isn't that? Why don't you have a declaration of war? I mean,
well, the thing, you know, the one element of resilience is that people are aware of it. There is a big debate about it. There is consciousness in the electorate, and that is already a good thing. The second thing is they can actually influence our voting because our voting is so old-fashioned. We still have, you know, manually making crosses at papers that are then counted individually, so you can't hack into some electronic device. So we are good for that. But you know, we discovered that the Russians now use the German Russians that came to our country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, 1 million or so. They're using them with their propaganda tools via the TV RT.
Wow.
So that's a new experience for us.
Jane?
But I think, again, here, consciousness is the best means for
Jane and Ed?
Well, first of all, the French, I thought, were very clever. They manipulated this without a big public speech and had fake websites, which the Russians used, which obviously didn't communicate the fake news that they intended to communicate. They also, the Russians misunderstood, or the French helped them misunderstand, that the election would go dark in the last day. So in the last hour of the day before, they spread all their stuff all over media, and no one could cover it, no one could receive it. So that was clever. So it doesn't always have to be noisy that you push back. I'm very worried about this. And it's not just manipulating voting machines, which is a problem. The US, again, has very old voting machines. They're all 10 years or more old. Think if you had a cell phone that was 10 years old, it wouldn't function very well. But I don't think the future should be to move to the past. I think the future should be to find a way. And the federal government, through the Department of Homeland Security, has declared our voting system critical infrastructure. So there is a way to help states, which regulate elections, do this better. But what I'm as worried about as manipulating voting machines is manipulating news. And we have learned this. And if you credibly, and this is what you're talking about, Steve, which is this enormous burst of social media, it can be easily manipulated, and people go into their echo chambers and they never come out, and so they believe what they are hearing, and it happens to all of us to some extent. And how to climb out of that ditch eludes me, and I think that has
Look,
to be a
there's a very
huge
nasty
focus.
escalation going on right now between Qatar, UAE, and the Saudis and
Right.
others. And as part of this equation, and look, they've been waiting to go at each other's throats for a while, but part of this was a completely fabricated speech ascribed to the Emir of Qatar that just never happened.
Right.
And it was created and put it in the mix. And I have to tell you that my friends in Saudi Arabia and UAE are absolutely convinced, in what is already a place where conspiracy theories have a lot of currency, that here's a key case where if you ended up in a hot war with Iran or something like this, that one of the major pieces of it was an entirely, completely fabricated speech. But Ed.
Well, look, I mean, the Protocol of the Elders of Zion was also fabricated. So this predates social media and technology. You know, it's about...
That's one of your points in the book, is that a lot of this has been with us for a long time.
We're going up to warp speed with this. I mean, in terms of dealing with fake news and the planting of these stories, you know, I don't know what the business model is for Facebook to actually have human beings go through stories as opposed to algorithms which produce very unsatisfactory ways of sorting fake from contentious. But even if their business model allowed for the hiring of thousands of people to do this instead of a machine, the contentiousness of who they are, what their biases are, would just play back into the original problem, is that we're deeply polarized, that we no longer believe we're entitled to our own opinions, we believe we're entitled to our own facts. So it gets back to what the source of the problem is. Did Putin manipulate the last election? Yes, but he was a secondary factor. We caused the problems by ourselves. We gave him the opportunity to exploit. So, you know, Putin is a big, big factor here. But the larger, I think, issue for the West in general, and America in particular, is China. And responding to the challenge of China and responding to the geopolitical shift that's going on in the world, as well as the enormous rolling impact of China on the economic well-being of many, many people. And China is now doing, in sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and elsewhere, what our companies did in China, which is it's outsourcing and bringing in vast new reserve army of labor. China is now doing generally a very positive thing, but the downward pressure on our incomes is a long-term thing. It's real, it's structural, it's long, and we need a better, dare I say it, this is a great panel for Germany, but we need to take some lessons from other Western democracies that are handling this better.
Great, thank you.
Can I add to that just
yeah,
one
real quick.
small thing? Remember, just to go back to this analogy of from agrarian to industrial, that there was a while when non-democracies did just as well, and in the 30s did better than us. I think there's another big question, maybe, you know, big ideas, Aspen ideas. There's another big question that in the era of automation and AI, will post-industrial is it better or worse for democracies? And China will have a way to deal with our relatives in a different way than you can in a liberal democracy, and does that give them an advantage? I don't know the answer to that, but it
One
really
of the big
scares
questions,
me.
right?
Yeah.
Let me open up the floor to all of you, and we'll get some questions, comments, and do the best we can until 11:15. Thoughts, questions? Yes, in the very back right here. And we have a mic runner here.
Hi there.
Привет.
Привет.
Мы будем говорить по-русски сейчас. We're going to speak Russian. No, just kidding.
Okay, as a Russian citizen, I'm afraid I have a problem with Mr. Wittig's remark about a Russian million Germans.
With Mr. Who's remark?
Mr. Wittig's remark
Okay.
about a million Russian Germans being sort of a ticking human bomb.
Right.
Mr. Wittig, they are German citizens just like you, and they have an agency, and they have their own thoughts about the Putin administration, and I'm afraid many of them will have an issue with them being painted as
I'm going to ask you short form. We've got to get through a lot of people, and I've got 15 minutes. So.
I'm afraid it's a dangerous path we're taking, because I read in a recent BuzzFeed article, a British intelligence officer said something about Putin using the large Russian-speaking community in the UK. Well, according to the latest census, there were 34,000 Russians living in the UK.
So let
in
me
a country
ask the
that's
ambassador
64
to
million.
respond. Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly. I didn't want to denounce the German citizens of Russian origin. My point was that with RT, Moscow is targeting this group, this segment of the German society, in a way that we had never seen before. And there was one particular incident, I don't want to go into details, a story that was out there, a fake story about a young girl being raped by a refugee, a young German girl of Russian origin being raped by a refugee. That was total fake and was, brought across by RT, and it was then denied by all the security agencies in Germany. It was just an example. I'm not saying that those German citizens of Russian origin somehow are the fifth column of Moscow, not at all. But it's a new phenomenon.
But it is part of Russia's toolkit of
It
what
is
Russia's
part of
trying to do,
Russia's
because they're
toolkit.
doing the same thing in Latvia, Estonia, Moldova, and continue in Ukraine. So that doesn't mean that those individuals or citizens there are automatically suspect in mass, but it is happening. Russia is doing that and attempting to create currency for things inside Russia is right now meddling inside the political operation. And they would argue that we've been doing this for years. The Americans have been doing this, just to be fair, but I think it's a bit different. But so thank you for your
Steve,
question. That's right up
just
here, John Debs. Yes.
One more
Yeah,
addition
yeah.
to that. RT has penetrated Europe and the greater
Right.
Europe in an enormous way. And in Ukraine, for example, almost all the TV coverage is RT. And you can say that's just how effective they've been, but they have been very effective at shutting out other media.
Well, you've been commenting on this before. I mean, Russia and China both put about $1 billion a year into global public communications and PR, et cetera, whatever that may mean. And the United States, in response, just is pretty pathetic, right?
Right.
Yeah,
I
there
think
we
so.
go. John?
So going back to Ukraine, there was a cyber attack, Tuesday, starting in Ukraine.
Right.
Looks like it's coming out of Russia, although I'll defer to my professor here, McFaul.
Yeah.
Taken
Quick
two
question.
wonderful
We don't have much
classes
time, so
yeah,
questions,
the question
yeah.
is, we're having these attacks every month now. It doesn't seem like anybody's really stepping up to.
Jane, that goes to you.
change
Are we stepping up?
I think the private sector is stepping up. I don't know if the government is stepping up. And one of the issues is, how ready is our government sector to respond to this? That ransomware attack was debilitated Ukraine, but it also penetrated a lot of U.S. industry and some of our PR firms and Maersk, the shipping company, and a lot of other places. And what's worrisome is ransomware is one thing. People shouldn't just pay the ransom. They should report this to law enforcement. But if there's ransom, if they've been able to penetrate the systems, they can also stay there. And so we have no idea, and it could be extremely serious, how deeply penetrated our mass systems are across the world.
Yes, sir, right here. And you're
Yes,
one of
hi.
our populists, so hi. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
I want
Hi.
to make a point and ask a question.
Sure.
So,
Just make it brief.
yeah, brief. Populism is inherent in liberal democracies. I think you all would agree,
Right.
right? So, I think if had Bernie Sanders become president, it would be a different conversation. Secondly, someone said that Vladimir Putin was only secondary. The fact that we allowed him to do it was first, the major problem. Mike Morrell said that this attack was a political equivalence of 9/11.
So the former deputy director of the CIA.
CIA.
Yeah.
So would you then say bin Laden was only secondary and that our intelligence failure was the primary reason for 9/11?
Great question. Thank you, Mike.
So I think there's a conceptual problem with cyber stuff. I agree with Mike. He's a colleague of mine. Somehow, like think about this. If Russian troops came down over the border from Canada to America, we would expect our government to respond, right? If somebody breaks into my house where I live, I call the government. My TV or I don't even have a TV. Yeah, I do have a TV. Something has been stolen. I ask the government to come. When I get hacked, and I'm attacked all the time, you might imagine, given my profile, who do I call? I call my IT guy. That's odd, isn't it? Isn't that odd?
Yes.
That data was stolen. Theft. It was a violation of our sovereignty. And I'm sorry I raised my voice because we got to stop using these words like hackers and it's all just you didn't lock your door, John Podesta. That's right, he didn't lock his door, he wasn't careful, but that doesn't justify the theft. So I think first conceptually we got to get that right, and we're as a society, we're nervous about that because when I worked in the government, and I had these things happen to me, the government was way more responsive. I've had FBI guys come to my house in Chevy Chase on a Saturday morning after something happened to me. I'll leave it at that. They didn't even do that for the DNC. And we have not figured out, in my mind, the right way, the balance between the government. I mean, I have a 7-point plan, and Steve's not going to let me give it, but I'll tweet it out after the session.
But you can email it to folks. Yes, right here.
Hi, good morning. There was an article this morning in Mr. Luce's paper about why Europe will never have a Trump.
Get the mic closer.
Why Europe will never have a Trump, and basically it was saying that the economic system
God, that's just
in
setting
the
them
US,
up, right? Yeah. So why won't? Yeah. So you want to ask why would you say something so inane, or
Well, it was just his paper.
Yeah.
But do you think there's some truth to that? I mean, they
Right.
use the word plutocracy to describe
Right.
the United States
Ed?
compared to Western Europe.
I didn't actually read the article in question, but it sounds plausible. Look, there's different political systems in Europe. I mean, Trump was in many ways a massive accident, even within this political system. I would argue, however, that Brexit is a longer-lasting equivalent of Trump, because we're not going to get rid of Brexit 3.5 years from now. We're going to live with this for the rest of our lives. So each country is different and unhappy in their own Tolstoyan way, as I say.
Great. This gentleman in the very back. And our friend with the mic, what's your name? Diana, thank you. So everybody give her a round of applause. I really appreciate how hard we're running you, so thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm really interested I was very interested to hear you guys talk about RT and how they penetrated, the news space. And I think there's a company that's similar in the IT space that's Russian, called Kaspersky Labs. There's probably got software running on maybe 50, 60, 70 million machines in the US. Yep. Are you guys concerned about that?
Jane?
Well,
Peter?
I was just in
is.
Ireland, and I met with Kaspersky Labs, and their story is, although they're based in Moscow, which they are protecting all of us from all these, possible threats. And certainly it seems plausible that they have the technology to protect us, but at least my view was maybe not.
Right. For those of you who want a deep dive on that subject, I highly recommend Alex Gibney's film 0 Days, which was one of those nominated for an Academy Award. But the labs are mentioned and taken on both sides. And so when the Stuxnet virus, I've never gotten a U.S. government official to admit it was a U.S. government, Israeli government joint venture, but nonetheless, most folks think so. That in the tracking and kind of the forensics of it, it's an incredible. And if you watch it, and you will never look at your iPhone or computer the same again ever. But yes, sir, right here in the far left. So another one of our engaged populists. I remember the hands that went up. So yes.
My name is Don Baker, and I'm
Hi,
an
Don.
antitrust lawyer. So I believe in both competition
Yes.
and incentives in markets. But I also believe that inequality is a serious problem.
Right.
And how does the panel suggest that we balance
Right.
the incentives for markets and dealing with the people who are
That's a great
left
question,
behind?
Don, and I want to piggyback on it because in responding, Ed, to that question about really what to do, how to solve inequality problem, but how to keep the right incentives of the system in place, you also recommend in your book a Marshall Plan for the middle class. And so I'd like to kind of add that because you talk directly about that. I don't know whether that's doable or not, but I found it a great catchphrase. Hashtag Marshall Plan for middle class.
Yeah, no, it's worth sticking to. Let me just sort of give a couple of data points. Since in the year 2000, 31% of Americans answered Gallups to whether they were lower class, middle class, or upper class. 31% said they were lower class. It's now 49%. It went from 31 to 49%, just under half in 2016. That's a really key data point, because if you look at what's happened in that period to the mortality rates and the life expectancy of big chunks of American demographics, it's gone down for the first time since war. It's a wartime thing, or a Russia in the 1990s thing. Now, between 2000 and 2016, look at what's happened to sale of fine arts. Look at what's happened to sale of luxury yachts. Look at the advertising rates in How to Spend It, our weekend magazine. Look at what's happened to the top 1%. It's just gone off the charts. Right. That's what's happening. And people perceive it, and it's not fake what they perceive. It's absolutely real. What to do about it? Well, Steve kindly mentioned Marshall Plan for the middle classes. I don't happen to be a Bernie Sanders supporter, and I don't think free public tuition for everybody is a very efficient use of public resources. But I think having a massive focus on learning at all ages, from early learning right up through your adult working life, the kinds of things we're seeing in Denmark that does it brilliantly, Germany to some extent, is an absolute precondition to having a labor force that is equipped to deal with this bewildering world. Inequality, just a final point. Look, we spend, if you add it all up, including the implicit subsidies, about $600 billion a year on mortgage subsidies in this country. No cap on them. The bigger your McMansion, the bigger the taxpayer subsidy you get. This is crazy. It's an absolute crazy squandering of resources.
I feel the real estate market in Aspen shaking right now.
And that's just one example.
Yeah, well, but that
Yeah, Jane.
entitlement reform, tax
You're right.
reform are things we have to do.
Yes.
On a bipartisan basis.
Yes.
And there was an opportunity which Obama squandered to enact Bowles-Simpson, which was a framework around doing those two things plus spending reform at the same time. Politically, they're all hard, so why not put it all in a package where everyone's a little unhappy? But that's right. But just to make one final point to you, you said you believe in free markets and innovation. I think you said that. And that's something we want to try to protect. That is why lifelong learning, which Aspen is a good part of, plus retraining of everyone, giving people a chance to contribute productively in a new economy are crucial.
We're right, yeah, Mike?
Just to add to this, I mean, the data is overwhelming. I have lots of friends who work on this at Stanford. Education is the variable that moves that in a way. These are big macro solutions. I hadn't heard Marshall Plan. That's a really big government-led thing, and I'm sympathetic to that. I would note that we have been stuck in terms of education reform at the national level for a long time. And I want to say you don't have to wait for the damn government, okay? You know, that where I grew up in Montana, we had a Carnegie Library. Remember, because I've been referring back to this other transitional time when the robber barons got a little nervous about the future of capitalism. You know, there's this thing called Stanford University that another robber baron started in terms of education. And that kind of investment we're not doing right now. None of you are doing. I mean, some of you are, but do it. Just do it. You don't have to wait for the government to come up with a Marshall Plan. I got a great colleague at Stanford. Her name's Fei Li. Write it down.
Short form.
She's got a new thing called AI for All. Invest in her. So that AI for all is in the Rust Belt as well as in the Valley. And where I live, the Valley is not doing this. And I try to say to them, look, folks, we've had this shock. We've had this scare. You need to be part of the solution of reform now.
Right.
And don't just wait for the government. You can do it right now. Stanford can do it, by the way.
Thank you.
And,
I
got a
apologize
7-point
to
plan
everyone.
for that,
We
too.
have to finish. We must finish right at. We have a hard stop at 11:15. So, lightning question, lightning answers, and we're going to round this up. And I apologize to those of you who've been so patient. Yes,
so
right here.
every candidate for Congress, whether they're Republican or Democrat, is running for the people. And when they're going to stand up to Washington, and once they get there, that doesn't happen. It doesn't matter
Right.
which party it is.
Okay.
So why?
Okay. Jane.
Okay, well, first of all,
Short form.
yeah.
It's a long
I
book.
think we should, the people who say what they're for, not just who they're against, have a much better shot of winning elections in this climate. In Washington, sadly, the business model of Congress is broken. Not all the people, especially the younger, more recently elected people, are not broken. But the model is to blame the other side for not solving the problem. If you work with the other side, you get penalized, you get a primary, and you get defeated. So what would be my advice? Someone has to, and it should be bottom up, lead the revolution against broken Congress on a bipartisan basis.
Right. Let me ask you guys each, 30 seconds each, a final question. I want to drop populism from this question, but I want to give you an opportunity to tell me if you had the choice to do one thing, move the needle on one issue, to sort of shore up liberal democracy and how we all feel about it and participate. What would be that one thing, Mike?
We'll get rid of primaries would be really effective.
Okay.
And the way, there's alternative ways to do it. That's part of the polarization that would help get to this question in Congress.
Peter?
Two possible disruptors for European institutions of liberal democracy: robots and migration. They are the great disruptors of the future. I would advocate, especially in the latter sphere, a kind of controlled system of immigration. That's hard to do, but we need that in Europe. We need to stop the uncontrolled immigration and come to a system of a checked, controlled immigration.
Jane Harman?
Toxic partisanship. It's going to suffocate all of the good answers.
Great, thank you. Ed Luce, final word.
Just very quickly, the Supreme Court's going to hear about political redistricting. As you know, right now, it's not voters who choose their politicians. Politicians choose their voters. I hope the Supreme Court does that. And another one, just to pick up finally on the AI robots point and make a parochial point about my country. AI is now at the stage where it can do negotiations in law. And I'm hoping that maybe we can sort of commission AI to do the Brexit negotiations for Britain. Because there's precious little human intelligence around in British politics at the moment.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador McFaul, Ambassador Peter Wittig, former Representative Jane Harman, and Ed Luce. And I will mention again Ed Luce's The Retreat of Western Liberalism, just out this week.